Welcome to the International Basque Podcast, brought to you by Wordbee. I'm your co-host Tanya Falkner.
And your co-host Robert Rogi.
And for this episode, we have Catharine Cellier-Smart joining us. Catharine, she's been a freelance translator since 2008, and she's mainly translating from French into English. She grew up in London, but is now based on Reunion Island. And this has actually led us to today's topic, as Catharine specializes in Reunion Island Creole. And that's what we're going to talk about. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you, and I'm pleased to be here.
Cool. So I guess let's kick things off with what is Creole as a language and how many Creoles are there? And let's have the overview of what Creole is.
Okay, well, opinions vary as how Creoles came about and what they are, but generally what most people say is that when you have a community of people who come together and who speak different languages, initially people will create pidgins to speak to each other. And when these people continue to live together and start to have children, these children will grow up speaking the pidgin, which is then called a Creole. So what a lot of people don't realize is that Creoles have their own grammar. They have their own grammatical structures, which can be quite complicated. And they have a tendency to be thought of as perhaps dialects or a broken version of the language that they tend to be a version of.
Oh, that's really interesting, that they're perceived to be a broken language. I mean, sometimes there's a certain amount of prejudice, I think, when we look at the way that people speak a related language or a dialect of a language. And there can be a lot of prejudice in how people see the way a certain person might talk, right?
Right. And I don't know how many listeners are familiar with the notion of diglossia. But diglossia is when you have a situation where two languages are spoken by a person or in a country, but generally one language is seen as being superior to the other language. And this can be the case for a lot of countries, a lot of places where Creoles are spoken. I know it certainly tends to be the case here in Reunion Island. So Reunion Creole is sort of, some people see Reunion Creole as being inferior.
Mm-hmm. So you said it established from other languages, right? From mixing cultures and mixing languages, basically. Is that right?
That's correct. Yes. Yeah.
So where's the difference then to, let's say, for example, something like Spanglish?
From what I know of Spanglish, you have elements of Spanish and you have elements of English, but it has an overall structure of one or the other language. I don't think it really can be called a Creole. Maybe linguists would call it a Creole, but I'm not a linguist in the academic sense. So,
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So what are the languages that make up Creole again, historically? It's Spanish, French.
In fact, you have approximately 140 different Creoles in the world. And so they tend to have a basis on one or other language. So, for example, you have about 15 or so Creoles that are based on the French language. You have a larger number that are based on English. And then you also have Creoles that are based on languages like Spanish and Portuguese. But you can also have Creoles that are based, for example, on the Hawaiian language. I think it's no longer spoken, but there was at one point a Creole based on the Hawaiian language. So it's not always, as it were, colonial languages that form the basis for Creole.
Is Creole only used in spoken language or written as well?
There are some countries that have a written form of Creole. For example, the Seychelles, which is elsewhere in the Indian Ocean, a little bit further north of Reunion. They have adopted Creole as an official language, and they do have a written form of Creole. I would say that for the case of, for example, Reunion Creole, it's one of the things that's holding back publication, in that you have different people who have different opinions as to how Creole should be written. Some people feel it should be written more like French, and some people are inclined to move further away from something that's similar to French spelling. And so because there's no official orthography for Reunion Creole, I feel it's holding publication of books and other literature. It's holding back. And it's a shame. And I think that's probably the case for a lot of Creoles.
That's super interesting. So, like, I'm thinking about dictionaries and, the concept of a dictionary and a grammatical rule book to, standardize the language, to make it so that everyone can be on the same page. In a way, it makes a lot of sense, right? But then on the other hand, the strange thing about dictionaries is that they're used as basically like a weapon of prejudice all the time. And yet you still need to form one. So how long have people on Reunion Island been working on establishing these rules?
As far as I'm aware, I think the first academic work on Reunion Creole took place, I think it started in about the 1970s. So bearing in mind a quick potted history of Reunion, Reunion is an island that was uninhabited until the mid-17th century and has been populated by people from Madagascar, Africa, mainland France, India and China over the course of the years. And so this is what has brought together this language combination, which has led to Reunion Creole. But I think that the academic work that has been done has been instrumental in helping to see already that Reunion Creole is a language and starting to get it accepted. I started living in Reunion in 1990, and although it was no longer illegal to speak Reunion Creole on the media since 1981, even in the early 90s, it was still not seen very well to be using Creole on TV or on the radio. Fortunately, that's no longer the case.
So is there a pushback then with people who, especially regarding, because you mentioned the spelling, right? That there's some people that want to spell or adhere closer to the French, and then some people that want to go further from the French. Is there some pushback now against spelling it closer to the French because people are thinking about colonial history?
No, I wouldn't say that. I think one of the arguments for having a spelling system that is closer to French is that it just simply makes it easier for people to read and understand, because even if most locals grow up with Reunion Creole as their native language, when it comes to learning reading and writing, that all happens in French. And so it would be easier for them to read something in a Creole that's more similar to French.
Interesting.
So,
see, I would go, sorry, Tanya, I would go, if it was me, I would go further from the French spelling, because French spelling is very difficult and doesn't have many rules. Like, everything I know about French spelling is like, okay, if you had to do it over again, there could be some simplifications you might make, right?
Yeah, no, I see where you're coming from. And it's also, if you want to Reunion Creole is sometimes considered as being one of the French-based Creoles that are maybe the closest to French. And if you compound that by having a written version that is also similar to written French, you sort of got to say to yourself, well, where is some people could think it can be instrumental in people thinking, oh, well, Reunion Creole is just a broken version of French. So, yeah, I think that this is the problem. There are arguments for and against having a spelling system that is close to French and that is quite far away.
So you're saying that reunions, they grow up with Reunion Creole as a mother tongue, but then everything in school is in French. And then on like radio and TV, is it both?
It's mainly, I would say on radio and TV, it's mainly in French, bearing in mind that there's, quite a lot of, especially TV channels that are from mainland France, a little bit less so on the radios. But yes, you can hear, somebody that wants to hear more or less only Creole on the radio can choose their radio station, and that will be the case. Or you have the state-run TV and radio channels. They also have a certain number of programs that are only in Creole, so they're catering for that.
What percentage of the people speak Creole on Reunion Island? Everybody, or?
I would say anybody that has been born and brought up here, or even people that haven't been born here but that have been brought up and gone to school, speak Creole. So I'd say it's fairly unusual to be born here and not speak it.
Is there a class divide about Creole? Like for example, if you were a higher income child, would you grow up in a French-speaking school? And if you were a lower-income child, would you grow up in a Creole-speaking school? Or are they all French-speaking schools? Or like, how does that work?
Well, I would say officially all schools are French-speaking schools.
Right.
No question of that. But then you might have a school where you have the especially at primary school level, you might have a school where the primary school teacher is going to be speaking more in Creole, and another school where the person is going to be speaking more in French, especially if that latter person is themselves from mainland France and not local.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it brings its own set of issues as well, because if you can imagine a child that spent about the first maybe 5 or 6 years of their life only speaking Creole, and then one day they're sort of parachuted into this environment where everything is in French, it can bring some problems.
How did you learn it then? Do you just pick it up, as you go?
Yeah, I picked it up. In my previous life, before I was a translator, I worked for about 15 years in business. And I would say maybe the first 6 years I was working in companies where I was the only non-local. And so even if, for example, colleagues spoke to me in French, between themselves or maybe to other people, they were speaking in Creole. So I just picked it up.
It's quite difficult, isn't it, to pick up a language where there's no written... I don't know, for me, I really learn most when looking at it. And I just feel like it's very complicated to learn something just by hearing it.
I agree. And despite all the years that I've spent here in Reunion, so we're talking more than 20 years, almost 25 years, I feel that because I don't have the grammatical basis for the language, I feel that I'm lacking in a number of respects, yes.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting. I mean, like when I read classic literature, for example, I mean, if you go back to a certain time, I mean, really even already in 19th century literature, you can still find a variety of spellings of the same word. You can find some different grammatical structures. Like in English, a really good example is the preposition, ending a sentence with a preposition. Mm-hmm. So, and if you're in the United States, for example, like you will grow up as a kid, they will tell you, oh, you can't end your sentence with a preposition. That's an inappropriate way to speak. If you want to be correct, you can't do this. But actually they invented that when they created the first Webster's dictionary in English to try to differentiate the American English from the British English. They just added in a rule that never existed before, right? And it was essentially a political thing. So I don't know, I mean, it's good to have a standardization, but then at the same time, languages, in my opinion, they should breathe, evolve, change. I don't know. I think it's better not to go too far to either side. That's just my personal opinion.
No, and of course, France, Reunion Island is the French Overseas Department. It's governed by France. And of course, in France, you have the Académie Française, who are very prescriptive about how French should be written, how it should be used. It's not like English, where we have no controlling body, no controlling authority, really, over the language. And I mean, there are dictionaries, but dictionaries are supposed to be descriptive and not prescriptive, aren't they?
Yeah, yeah, totally. That's what I think too. Yeah, descriptive, not prescriptive. So is there a governing body for Creole there that's trying to decide this stuff? Is there an official organization of some kind, or?
There are a certain number of committees that I'm aware of. I don't think we could say that there is one particular body that is takes precedence over another, no.
Do you know, I think you mentioned there are over 140 Creoles. Do you know which one is the one with the biggest population of people speaking it?
Off the top of my head, I don't know, no, but I think there are a certain number of Creoles spoken, for example, in Africa, in particular Nigeria. I think there's a language in Nigeria which is called Pidgin English. And although it's called Pidgin English, it is actually a Creole. So I believe, we're talking there maybe several million speakers. So, yeah, I think that would be that would be the case in some African countries. It's true as well that a lot of Creoles are spoken on islands, and so not a lot of islands have massive populations.
Well, now I'm thinking about Belgium. because I could not tell you how many of my French friends have made fun of the way they speak French in Belgium or Quebec. And, you know, I don't know. Sometimes people they can have a colonial mentality about language and they don't even realize it. You know, it's like, oh, ha, 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 look at the way those people are speaking French. And it's like, well, I mean, do you own French? Like, is your name on it? Like, maybe you're the one speaking bad French.
Yeah. Yeah, it's relative, isn't it? It's really from the point of view of, from your standpoint, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah.
Right. So are there any famous books or poems written in Creole? Like
written directly into Creole, I think there's a French poet called Le Comte de Lille who is from Reunion, who has he lived in the 19th century, and he wrote a certain number of poems in Creole, in Reunion Creole. There's a number of books that have been translated into Reunion Creole, but when I say books, sort of short graphic novels and such like, I think that in maybe, for example, in the French West Indies, you have more literature that has been directly written into Guadeloupean or Martinique Creole.
So those islands have their own Creole as well?
Exactly, yes. They are other French overseas departments and they have their own Creole. To give you an example of how different Creoles can be, so the nearest land to Reunion is Mauritius. So it's about 200 kilometers away. Mauritius has its own Creole. I know that some people from Reunion can go to Mauritius and understand the Creole. Me, because I'm lacking, as we were saying earlier, I'm lacking the sort of very solid basis in Reunion Creole. I have trouble understanding Mauritian Creole, and it's only 200 kilometers away. And the Seychelles, which are 1,000 kilometers away, I just cannot understand it at all.
Mm-hmm.
But it's because of the different histories and different linguistic inputs. The Seychelles and Mauritius, for example, had more. There was a British colonial influence, so there's more English in them.
Well, it's interesting too. I mean, like it wasn't that long ago, really, when being on the other side of a river might mean you speak two different languages, right?
And I think that's still the case in Papua New Guinea, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah,
right.
Isn't it the country with the most languages or something?
I think there's 800 different languages in Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
Wow.
It's crazy.
I didn't even know that.
Even in Reunion, so Reunion is about the size of Luxembourg, or the state of, I think it's about the size of New Jersey. So it's not a very big island. And I mean, you go to the south or you go to some of the inner parts of the island and, the Creole even here has variations and a different accent.
Hey, as you know, we like to keep things mostly non-commercial around here, and we like to just stick to interviewing the guests about fascinating subjects. But we would like to take a moment to mention a little bit about Wordbee Translator. Wordbee Translator is the translation management system developed by Wordbee over the last 10 years. So we are celebrating 10 years now. It's all in one system, so you can manage projects. It also has linguistic tools. It has tools for finance, business analytics, and it's been around for 10 years, so it does pretty much anything you want. Before working for Wordbee, I also used Wordbee Translator. One of my favorite things about it was actually the invoicing, because it made it really easy to manage supplier invoices, create them, and just not have to deal too much with the financial side of things. But other customers appreciate other things, like, for example, it's a native cloud technology, so it's really collaborative. You can keep track of what's going on in there at any moment in your project. It's easy to set up different job assignment methods. You can check your stats at any time. You can see how your project managers are performing. You can see how your translators are doing. And yeah, it does pretty much everything you want. It ends up fitting your organization like a glove, as we say. So that was just a word about Wordbee Translator. Now, without further ado, back to the podcast.
So the poems that you mentioned, and like since there's no official written Creole, is it just like the person who wrote them just wrote them in his own sort of style, or are there any guidelines then?
Yeah, no, he just wrote as he felt fit. So yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's one way to do it.
Well, it wasn't that long ago. We were doing the same thing in English, and in German too. you know?
Really?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know how long ago it was, but, well, I don't know. I guess we could look it up. But like, when was the first German dictionary published, you know? Like, I have no idea. But I
Me
suppose
neither.
like 18th century, you know?
There is a dictionary of Reunion Creole, so it's not the authoritative version of the language. But I know that if I ever have to write anything in Creole, and if somebody was to say something to me, oh, you haven't written that in the right way, I would say to the person, well, I've based it on such and such dictionary. So
Maybe now is the time to make your own dictionary. Like, you know, the Cellier-Smart dictionary. Like you, like 300 years from now, there could be like, you know, maybe they'll be on like the 100th edition of the Cellier-Smart dictionary of Creole.
that would be great, wouldn't it? I've actually done some word lists, some glossaries on my blog from Reunion, some sort of popular, as it were, well-known Creole words into English. But because there are very, very few visitors here who speak English, I don't think there'll be a lot of demand.
There might be one day.
Yeah.
So why do you think that Creole still exists? Why hasn't it gone extinct?
I think we could ask the same question about any language. I think I was saying earlier on, Creoles are often spoken on islands. You have people that have a certain distance from other places. I'm not saying people are isolated, but I think in any context where you have a group of people in a certain place, they will start their own way of speaking, and that way of speaking will continue. And I hope that that will continue to be the case. I hope that will carry on. We keep hearing that lots of languages are disappearing every day. It's true that for a place like Reunion, where there's a lot of input from French, maybe one day Reunion Creole is going to get swallowed up by the French language, but I sincerely hope not.
So what's in your opinion, what's the benefit of trying to preserve languages, and what should we do about all these languages that are becoming extinct or might become extinct?
I think we need to learn them and spread them as much as we can. I think it's only through a language that you can understand a culture. And so if a language dies, you're going to have a lot more trouble understanding the culture.
But wouldn't the culture change too?
You mean that the language should change because the culture is changing, or?
No, like if I'm not, this isn't what I think. I'm just asking that, like, if a language becomes extinct naturally, or it gets swallowed up by another language, or, you know, there's a lot of, like you said, that's happening in a lot of different places. I understand that it helps to understand the culture, to understand the language, but then if the language disappears, then is it still helpful?
You mean helpful to learn or helpful to?
Yeah, or even to understand the culture, I guess, like, you know, because what I'm saying is that I guess, like, if right now there's, you know, this whichever language is being spoken in country, and then it disappears, and 50 years later someone still knows how to speak it because they were studying it, then I guess that they would have an understanding of the culture, but it would be the culture from 50 years ago. I guess that's what I'm saying. Kind of like learning Latin today.
Yeah, but I mean, Latin in some respects has been updated, hasn't it? I mean, I think there are modern children's books that have been translated into Latin. So, language can still evolve. I think there are examples of cultures where they have created new words for out of their old language for things like the internet and computers and such like. So, I think it's always useful to have a different outlook on the world through another language. I had a small insight into that when I lived in Asia. I lived in South Korea for 3 years. I went with wonderful intentions of learning to speak Korean as fluently as possible. Unfortunately for me, I would have had to spend all day, every day of my 3 years there learning it, just to become fluent. But from the basics of the language that I learned, I got to understand that the Korean mindset is very collective. In the West, we have a tendency to be quite individualistic, and it's much less the case in South Korea anyway. And this transpired through the language. It really transpired through the language. So I found that fascinating.
Yeah, each language is like a little treasure. My opinion is that we should collect as many treasures as we can. So people, it would be so cool if there was even like a movement dedicated to learning and preserving languages, because like you said, like sometimes you wonder, is it a chicken or an egg thing? Like how does a language affect the way people think and the rest of the culture, and how does the culture affect the language? It's amazing how they work together.
Yeah, I think it's a big debate, isn't it, at the moment?
Right. Yeah. Did you see the movie Arrival?
I did, yes, I loved it, yeah.
Yeah, me too. Maybe there's a language, we just let it go extinct and we didn't realize it, but it would have let us travel in time or see the future. We should keep these languages around.
That sounds like a good idea for a film script.
That's true.
Totally.
Arrival Part 2 or something.
Right.
So, do you think that in order to like sort of preserve Reunion Creole, they will at some point also teach like in schools and everything in Creole, or do you think they'll keep the French?
There are movements to teach in Creole. There is, for example, a bachelor's degree that you can do in Creole, in Reunion Creole at the university. And I know there has been a movement in some schools to teach certain lessons in Creole. And I mean, these are things that weren't happening a few years ago. Mm-hmm. So I'm just crossing my fingers that things will carry on like this. And I think that France has, and a lot of countries, have realized over the past few years that other languages are a source of wealth for a country, and I'm saying wealth obviously in the figurative meaning and not in the literal meaning, and that they need to be preserved. But to be preserved, sometimes they might need help. They might need a helping hand through teaching. So, but I just hope that this movement to teach more Reunion Creole in the classrooms will carry on.
Mm-hmm. That's like with some languages. I believe Welsh is also something that they haven't taught in years, but then they've started again just a couple of years ago, if I'm not mistaken, to actually make it mandatory in school to preserve the language.
Yeah, I think it dates back a little bit more than a couple of years. But yes, there has been in recent decades, yes, there has been a movement to increase the number of Welsh speakers, yes. Mm. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I still, like the differentiation between a Creole and a language, if I look at Welsh and Reunion Creole, I mean, how come you don't just call it a language?
But it is a language. Okay. It's maybe me who didn't explain things properly at the beginning. A Creole is a language. It's a certain type of language.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The old saying, a language is it's a dialect with an army and a navy, isn't it?
So why do there must be somewhere some resistance to putting Creole in the schools, for example. What is the nature of that resistance?
Well, I can give you an example. You have a school here in Reunion, which is a sort of a hotel and catering industry school. And a few years ago, there was a movement to have Creole taught in this school, as well as English. And a lot of people were saying, why are we taking away hours of teaching English or another foreign language to these pupils who are going to be working in the tourist industry? And why are we teaching them Creole when the only people that they can speak Creole to are other people from Reunion? So that's an example of resistance. I must admit, I don't actually know where things stand on that point at the moment, but yeah, you can see both sides of the argument.
Where is Reunion at in terms of the Army and the Navy then?
I don't think it's very far.
Right. Yeah. Right. Maybe you need to work on the Army and the Navy first. I don't know.
Yeah, probably the Navy, because as Reunion is an island.
Right.
Well, I guess it's sort of a silly question because as there's no official written Creole, but is there any, like, I think I saw on your website that and like I mentioned before, you specialize in also Creole, so like translating from Creole to English. Is there any technology support for that, like machine translation or anything for Creole?
Nothing that I'm aware of. No.
Mm-hmm.
I believe one of the most well-known Creoles, especially to people in the US, is Haitian Creole.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that possibly there are things for Haitian Creole, but I might be wrong. But I think I think a lot of Creoles are pretty low down on the list for the people who are dealing with Creoles.
It's so interesting, and it's so socio-economic, like I remember in university, because I studied, for a while, I studied social linguistics, and like there's this famous example in the States in Atlanta, like that's where, I don't know if you know, like CNN or Turner Broadcasting and all that. So there are all those big companies are in Atlanta, and there was this like influx of people, like professional people, moving to Atlanta to work for all of these big companies, right? And then previously, the Atlantan like dialect, I hope I'm getting this story right, was a little bit, or the accent, sorry, the way that they were speaking was lighter than the sort of the stronger accent of the countryside surrounding Atlanta in Georgia, right? And but then when all of these people from outside of the state started moving to Atlanta, the people from Atlanta felt like they needed to show that they were from there more. So they started speaking with a heavier accent that was the one that people were using on the countryside to show that they were original Atlantans. And not these new coming Atlantans, And I don't know, there's so many examples of social linguistics and little prejudices that get embedded in people's minds about how language should be spoken. And I don't know, I find this subject to be super interesting.
There's an example like that. There is or was a project to translate the Bible into Reunion Creole. And so the people who are working on this project received a remark, well, why on earth are you translating the Bible into Reunion Creole? Why? And of course they replied, well, the Bible in French isn't any more valid than the Bible in Reunion Creole. The Bible wasn't written directly into French. The Bible in French is already a translation from another language. So if it's in Reunion Creole, it's just another translation.
Right,
so it's more or less valid than in French.
Yeah, of course. And it's even more valid if the person that is reading it can understand it better, because that's his or her preferred language, right?
Exactly.
Well, and the Septuagint is like one of the most famous translations of all time. So like you would think that people would be not asking, this question of translating the Bible to Creole.
Yeah.
Is there a difference for you in translating from Creole or from French? I mean, apart from obviously that it's two different languages, but I don't know, are there any other differences?
I would say that after so many years in a French-speaking environment, I rarely have trouble understanding something that's written in French. With Reunion Creole, I can sometimes have some doubts, does this mean this or does this mean that? Mm-hmm. So sometimes I need to check with a native speaker of Reunion Creole more so than French. So I would say that for me that's the main difference. Having said that, the demand for translations from Reunion Creole into English is pretty rare. There is sometimes demand in the other direction, so from English into Reunion Creole. And of course, then I transfer it to native Reunion Creole colleagues.
Cool. Well, I'm out of questions. This was a super interesting podcast.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I agree. I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too.
Yeah, and maybe we should have more guests on the show to talk about specific languages. Like, it would be neat to talk about some of the Native American languages as well that are sort of, on the brink.
Yeah, it's good to raise awareness for this.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Spark some interest.
It does.
I believe last year I attended the FIT conference in Australia, and there are a number of presentations to do with Australian languages. and Aboriginal languages. And I found it very interesting to learn that Aboriginal languages suffer from the same problem as Creoles. So there is a general tendency to think that only one Creole exists. And it's the same for Aboriginal languages. There are quite a lot of people who believe that only one Aboriginal language exists, whereas there are quite a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, it's really a kind of a prejudice in a way. I mean, people, maybe they don't realize that they're being prejudiced when they do it because they just don't know any better. But, assuming that all these different people speak the same language is sort of, when you think about it, it's a pretty big assumption to make.
Especially in Australia, like, it is so big. It's if you were saying everyone in Europe speaks the same language.
Yes, exactly. Yes, yeah. And I think one of the examples that we were given that really stuck with me was the fact that in some of the more remote areas, you might have a person, for example, in Northern Australia, for whom English is their seventh language.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Wow.
Wow. But, it's a good thing. I mean, they learn a lot of languages, and I'm pretty sure they still have to be fluent in English, even if it's only their seventh language.
But yeah, there's a whole Aboriginal language interpreter service in Australia who are helping Aboriginal peoples in legal and medical situations. So that does help if there's a lack of fluency in English.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, it's interesting. I don't know. It just seems to me like when people, read white people, sometimes when they try to help other people, they also start to enforce their cultural doctrines without realizing it, And I wonder if that happens, even in a case as simple as trying to help someone, if that doesn't in some way show them that, your language doesn't work. I don't know if I'm not saying that right, but there's so much prejudice involved with language, and it's so deep inside people's heads that they don't even see it or that realize that it's there.
Yeah, that comes back a little bit to what we were saying at the beginning about diglossia, where you have a situation, sort of a hierarchy of languages, and where one language is seen as inferior to the other, especially in sort of any official situations.
Yeah, diglossia. That's the word of the day. We're going to tweet that.
It is, yeah.
I don't know how to spell it, but I'm going to look it up, and Google is going to correct my spelling.
Okay. Well, I guess that word is a good thing to end and wrap up with, except if you want to add anything, either of you.
No, I'm good. I'm just eager to go do my research now, do more research.
Well, then this was another episode of the International Bus, and thank you, Catharine Cellier-Smart, for joining us.
Thank you. It was lovely to be with you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.